When working with Rails in RSpec, you may have noticed that there are two different helper files for your tests. There's spec helper and Rails helper. It can be confusing when you're getting started about which is for what and why they're separate, and the benefits and uses of each. So I want to explain to you different RSpec helpers and walk through what they serve, because they do serve separate purposes and it's good to understand them. I have Rails installed. We're just going to start from scratch. I've got Rails 7.4.0, Rails.7.0.4. The Rails version doesn't really matter here, but because this hasn't changed for quite a while. But we'll do Rails new, and we'll call it spec helper versus Rails helper. Silly name for an app, but that's fine. We'll do capital T, which says don't install anything with tests, and we'll use SQLite 3 because I don't want to use anything else for this. I don't even think we'll need a database. This sets up a new Rails app, does a bunch of stuff. All that's fine and good. Let's go into this code base, RSpec, or it's spec helper versus Rails helper. And let's first go and get RSpec installed, because that's important. Rails has a bunch of things included by default, which is fine. We've got development test, and RSpec generally wants you to put that in there. And we'll just do the default as is, and we'll bundle. So that installs RSpec Rails and all of its related dependencies. And then we will generate the basic RSpec config from the generator that comes with it. And you can see that that created 4 files, and this is, or 3 files in one directory. The .rspec file, spec/spec helper, spec/Rails helper. Let's look at RSpec. That just says require spec helper. So if you run bundle exec RSpec, it automatically includes require spec helper, which is pretty nifty. Let's also do bundle bin stub generate RSpec core. Bundle bin stub. Did that do it? Okay, it did. So now we have RSpec. If we run RSpec, there's no examples, no failures. And that is, a new app. So let's look at those files that were created in spec. So we have spec and Rails helper. This is what I was talking about. Now this tells you that has a bunch of info about loading the files, and given that this is always, and they know that this is something that people are aware of, the difference between these, because they have all these comments about it. So let's just talk through it. Given that it is always loaded, you are encouraged to keep this file as lightweight as possible. Requiring heavy dependencies from this file will add to the boot time of your test suite on every test run, even for an individual file that may not need all of that loaded. Consider making a separate helper file, which they do automatically for you, with that in there. So it comes with some sensible defaults, and I think those are pretty nice. And then there are even more defaults that if you delete that line, it comes with, which I think these are all good defaults. So we've got our spec helper. Now let's look at Rails helper. Now the difference is this this requires spec helper, so it uses everything configured in here, and it loads Rails. So it goes require relative to environment, so we can look at that file here. This requires the entire Rails application and initializes it. So it's pulling in Rails and all of the dependencies. If we're in production, it doesn't let us run it, which is fine, and then it requires everything that we would need in RSpec Rails for that to work. It then does some certain things for migrations, and has additional configurations for using RSpec with Rails. And that's about it. But let's look at the difference of these files right now. So let's go ahead and write a spec. So here we're going to go and make a directory called lib, because we're not really working in, we want to write some code that maybe doesn't use Rails, and maybe we're writing a library. So we'll add a lib directory, and we're going to add tests for Let's call it want to test something that is non-trivial. Okay, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna make something called word count spec RB, and it counts the number of words in a string. And we want this to be excluded from our business logic, and it's just like a thing that counts words. So we'll call it word count, and we'll define a method. Oh, but this is our test. So yeah, let's do test first. So we'll require spec helper. We'll RSpec.describe word count, and we'll say it. We'll describe the method. We'll describe a class method called count. And then we'll say expect word count dot count. Hi there. 2 equal 2. You could also say 2b2 because 2 is a constant here. Or, yeah, I guess, is it a constant? Or is it a literal? I don't know. But 2 won't change, right? So you could say 2b, but I just use 2 equal to be consistent. And let's go ahead and run this test. I think I just sent that to a weird pane. We'll just run it over here. Spec lib word count spec. Bundler not executable. Oops, that's supposed to be RSpec. So be RSpec, or we could do bin RSpec. Let's do bin RSpec because I generated it. Might as well use it. So we run it. It says uninitialized constant word count, because we don't have that file. So let's go into lib. We'll define word count. Run it again. Still don't have word count. Run it again. Still don't have it. Let's require word count. Okay, different failure. And expect word count, undefined method count. So we'll just define that. Self.count, because it's a class method. Right, this is the normal TDD type stuff, right? Make the smallest possible change, run the test, see it fail. It wants arguments, so we'll pass in string. Oops. It returns the number of words in the string. And the code that we're actually writing here doesn't matter. This is just like a trite example. Expected to got nil. We'll say string dot split at spaces count. Okay, that passes. Now here is what we care about. Is right now this finished in 0.00182 seconds. The files took 0.042 seconds to load. So it ran the tests pretty fast, and it took 0.04 seconds to load. Let's put that in a note file so we can compare, right? Loaded in 0.04, ran in 0.001. Now let's change spec helper to Rails helper. This will illustrate the difference. If we run that same file, it took just about the same amount of time to run, but it took 1.07 seconds to load. So the test time was not only slower, I mean, it was still pretty fast to run the test, right? 0.01 seconds, but that's in comparison to 0.0. So let's call this, we'll put spec helper, Rails helper. Right? This is the difference between those files. The difference is loading the files in 0.04 seconds or loading them in 1.0 seconds. What is the math there? 1.0 divided by 0.04. 1.0 divided by, let's do it in IRB instead of Alfred so you can see what I'm doing. So we'll say that divided by 0.04228. So result, the spec helper loads the files for testing 25 times faster. Now, isn't that amazing, right? Run this again. Rails does then begin to cache and what the heck's that thing called? Not TurboLinks. Spring is running, I would imagine. We'll say with Spring. So still runs the test a lot slower, right? 10 times slower, but loads it faster on running it again, which, you know, still though, even with Spring, it's what? Let's see, 0.04228 to 0.45144 divided by that. It's still 10 times faster. Even with Spring, spec helper is 11x faster. I'll just round down, 10x faster, right? So yeah, sure, Spring's making it better, which is valuable because you are going to want to use Rails helper in different times and places. But what I'm trying to show you is that there's a difference. Just changing one line here makes a difference in how fast your tests run. And they serve different purposes, which I'll dig more into in a second. But okay, we're back there. Yep, still ran really fast. Just wanted to make sure, you know, that that's right. And this is, now let's explain what's happening when you require Rails helper. When you require Rails helper, it goes into the Rails helper in RSpec, this file here that we talked about earlier. And it, you know, there's not that much code. There's a lot of comments here, which can be a little like, you know, makes it seem like there's a lot. But really, if we got rid of these comments, there's not a lot going on in here. It's got some additional configurations. Yeah, sure, it requires RSpec Rails, which has more code. But this is the line that is like destroying our speed, right? And let's open that up again, because I think that's valuable to see. Load the Rails application, require relative application. Okay, let's look at application RB, which is what that loads. This is the problem. It requires boot, which is fine. It requires all of Rails. It requires all of the frameworks we need. And then it requires all of the gems in our gem file. So what it's doing is, by just changing our spec file to be, where did our spec file go? To just be Rails helper, it's requiring all of Rails, all of the dependencies Rails requires, all of the gems in our gem file that aren't loaded by Rails, right? There's so much code, right? We're talking thousands of Ruby files that RSpec boots up, you know, that's what application initialize does, requires it all, and then runs our tests. But the thing is that, like, for a pretty, if you're following the testing pyramid, which is saying that the least amount of tests you should have are integration and acceptance tests, and the most you should have are fast unit tests. For a lot of those unit tests, you're just testing methods. It's not too dissimilar to word count, even if they are active models or active record models, or even like certain like sidekick workers, right? There are just different pieces of code where really we're just testing this line of code, and we don't care about the rest of Rails. And if we do care about the rest of Rails, we can usually like mock it and then stub the values and make it much faster and use things like Rails helper. But let's just continue down this like conspiracy theory of like why it's slow by looking at the gem file lock. So gem file lock, you have your gem file, you define the dependencies here. And this is just like what comes with Rails out of the box. Now, chances are that as your application exists for years and years, or if it's already years and years old, you probably have 30 plus gems. That's like totally normal, right? Like I've worked on projects where there's like 50 gems, and that's even more code that gets loaded. That's even slower of a boot time, right? Like just Rails out of the box to boot is slowing down our tests to take almost half a second. And that's like what Rails gives you, right? It gives you all these things, which is nice. But those things come at a cost, which is slowness, even with things like Spring. So let's look at gem file lock and just kind of really look through what's needed and what's required. Because the gem file can be deceiving, because a given gem might require a bunch of other gems. So like Action Mailer, a part of Rails, requires all of these other gems with them. So we go in here, and some of these are duplicates, like they might require the same things multiple times, but all of these dependencies mean slower boot time when you're using Rails helper. Now, you're thinking, okay, yeah, Brett, this word count is so trivial and you're just putting it in lib, and that's not very helpful. How do I use this in my normal code? And that is where you get into the fine art of like intentional unit testing with RSpec in your Rails code base. And the first thing is, put your code in lib where it makes sense. If you're writing like a library or a service or some sort of code that is contained enough where you're like, this isn't like core data model of the business or the needs of the application, but is like secondary or tertiary, and see if you can write it all in plain Ruby without Rails and put it in lib. And then you can require spec helper. And then your tests will be much faster. And then as you're building out that code and writing it, the feedback loop of running the tests is much faster. An example of this. At work, we recently integrated with new PayPal APIs, and the PayPal APIs didn't have a Ruby library, which a lot of APIs do, and because it was pretty new. So what I did was, in lib, I defined a PayPal client that makes HTTP requests and parses the response and handles logging and errors and everything like that, and it's all written in 100% plain Ruby. This meant that I could define this entire PayPal client with fast tests and then drop it into the areas in the application and just leverage it. And then, so not only is it like faster to test and a much better developer experience, it also has a nice separation of concerns where that PayPal client library doesn't rely upon Rails and the business needs. And so it led to a better design code. So that's one thing. See what you can put in lib and use the spec helper. The second thing is that you need to be conscientious of adding things to your gem file because there's a cost, right? For every gem you add, that's more files that need to be loaded up and booted with your whole application, whether that's when you're running tests or otherwise. So there's a cost to pulling in a bunch of gems. Be diligent about it. And there are gems that will be really helpful, but there are other times where maybe you could write the code yourself or use a snippet from it, or, there's a cost to it. So I just want you to be aware of that and see if there are ways to isolate parts of your code from Rails. And instead, if it can be expressed in Ruby with passed in objects that you can control, then you don't need all of Rails there. If you have a model that's using the database, like a users table, and you want to test queries, you probably want to test that the queries are working, and you'll need Rails and that stack there. But there are a lot of other times when writing code that you can isolate the logic and not need to require all of Rails and have fast tests. Now, if you run your whole test suite, it will be as slow as the slowest helper that you require. So like that boot time, like requiring spec helper in word count like we were doing, that's faster when we're running just word count, but it's not faster when like for the whole test suite, because when you run an entire test suite, it loads everything and it has like the lowest common, or it's like whatever spec helper is the slowest, it'll load it all up. And so that's the difference between spec helper and Rails helper. That is, I hope that helped, because when you look at Rails helper, you could think, if this is all Rails, why wouldn't I just use it? But there's a difference. There's a time to use them differently. Any code you load or require or automatically deal with in either of these files will slow things down. So just be aware of that. And try to keep like this says, keep it lightweight, keep it trim. Don't require a bunch of things in your spec helper. Instead, require them in your Rails helper when you need them in Rails, and use this for really fast unit testing. And let's look at these notes again, just to show the difference, right? Spec helper loads 25 times faster just from like a cold boot in Rails, and with Spring, it's still 10 times faster. So keep that in mind. Hope that helps. Sorry that I didn't get into like configuring RSpec and more specifics on those files, but The comments that come from the generated files, like all in here, are actually really, really helpful. And like this, requiring supporting Ruby files, it even has the code there, I think. You can just uncomment that, and that'll load everything in spec support and require it. So pretty cool and definitely useful. Hope this was useful for you. Thank you so much. See you next time. Bye.